Canada has joined with its allies in identifying malicious cyber activity by Russia, which are denounced.
This is not the actions of a great power. This is the actions of a pariah state, and will continue working with allies to isolate them.
Their nimbleness in this regard, their efforts in this regard, shows, I think, their sophistication and what, obviously, the resources of a state-backed hacking organization that can not only do the cyber intrusions from home, but can also send its officers abroad with diplomatic passports in order to do this.
A number of Western nations, including Canada, are accusing Russia today of running a global campaign of cyber attacks. The alleged victims range from a global chemical weapons watchdog to anti-doping agencies, including one based in Montreal. And Murray Brewster is here with the latest. Hey, Murray, nice to see you. Thanks for coming.
Hi, Vashi.
Appreciate it. Okay, so what do we know? What is the latest on this U.S. indictment?
Well, we do know that 7 Russian military intelligence officers were indicted by the U.S. today. They laid out these charges, and the charges involve, specifically where Canada is concerned, 2 Canadian agencies that are involved in making sure that sports are clean. The World Anti-Doping Agency in Montreal, but also the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sports. Both of them were hacked in 2016. We knew about those hacks. They were made public at the time. It was sort of suspected that the Russians were involved, but today we got confirmation and an actual pointing of the finger at the very specific Russian agency that is allegedly involved.
What do we know about the nature of the hacking?
What we know about the nature of the hacking is that the Russians, according to the U.S. indictment, attempted to get into these various agencies around the world, because it's not only just the anti-doping agencies. And the reason, by the way, the anti-doping agencies were targeted was because of their vocal support for the ban of Russian athletes at the Rio Games a few years ago. But what we do know is the Russians attempted to get into these agencies using methods that we're all familiar with, basically being tricked into clicking on a link that will give up your password and your codes and authentications. But what's really interesting in this indictment is it shows that when they were unsuccessful at being able to do that, the Russians dispatched specific teams to the various countries or the various targets, where they would get those teams close to the target agencies and then try to hack into vulnerable Wi-Fi connections. And they got in that way. So there are a whole bunch of questions to be answered.
Yeah. Do we know if they did that on Canadian soil?
We don't know that. And it is a question I put to the RCMP, and the RCMP would not say exactly what is going on, because they did confirm at the U.S. Event, or the U.S. media availability today in Washington, that they are conducting their own independent criminal investigation. But they won't say what that involves and whether there were Russian teams operating on Canadian soil.
Interesting. Wow. Okay, thanks a lot, Murray. Appreciate
You're welcome.
it. So how is Canada's cybersecurity agency reacting? Joining me now is Scott Jones, head of the new Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. Hi, Mr. Jones. Nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming in. From where you're sitting, how big of a deal is today's news, essentially that Canada has confirmed Russia was responsible for the 2016 hacking incident involving the Canadian-based World Doping Agency and the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport?
Well, frankly, it's a show of just how vigilant we need to be on cybersecurity matters. Many nation states are using these techniques, and Russia's certainly among them. This coordinated effort amongst a lot of our allies to kind of bring this forth and say, okay, this is enough. We need to do something about this and take some measures to stop the actions.
Is Russia really among many others, or is Russia the standout? Because this was the press conference today, the level that you read through the indictment, it seems like a big deal. Is it? You're the expert. Is it?
Certainly, what you've seen today is that Russia is taking a lot of steps in cybersecurity in terms of really aggressive actions. And I think the key thing is we've said, as the international community, we've said, okay, we need to take a step back. We need to protect ourselves. We need to protect our democracy, protect our ability to work, and frankly, play sport in a fair and open manner. And so that's really what we've been focusing on. Okay,
so in this case, how do we protect ourselves? How does your organization, from your vantage point, how do you protect yourself?
So that's what the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity was set up to do. It's to help Canadians take those steps to protect themselves online. For the case of, for example, say, to protecting democracy. We released our report last year on the threats to the democratic process. But get cyber safe, simple things we can all do. But then there's the critical infrastructure sector and the government side.
And that's what I'm interested in, given today's news.
Absolutely, and that's where we're going to we've given specific advice, specific steps people need to take to protect themselves against this activity, but also all activity in general. Really starting to, how do we raise that bar? How do we make ourselves less
vulnerable?
Less vulnerable, exactly, in terms of the cyber activity that could be targeting against us.
How vulnerable are we? I mean, what does this show us about our vulnerability? Because there are some really interesting ways in which this happened. For example, the indictment spells out that it wasn't just, that yes, they used the normal email, click on a password, but they also physically were near targets and accessed vulnerable Wi-Fi.
Well, and that absolutely shows that cyber is just one element of a broader set of activities that people will undertake. But what it also says is that we can never rest. We always have to continue to advance our cybersecurity. We continuously need to look at what protection measures are we taking and continue to raise that bar. And that's something that we have to do a little bit, little by little, step by step. And that's really what we're focusing on here.
Do you know if Russians were on Canadian soil hacking those? If we were one of the targets mentioned in that indictment and there were Russians here physically and they hacked the vulnerable Wi-Fi around the targets?
I'd need to leave that to the RCMP, who have an active investigation ongoing.
The RCMP won't say anything. Do you think that's fair? And I'm asking you for, I know you're here from, your organization has put a primacy on communication with the public. And I think the public is worried about the scale of this threat.
I honestly wouldn't know if there were people on my activities outside. So both one for an intelligence side of things, but also in terms of cybersecurity. I'm looking for the different threat vectors that are out there. And that's the key thing here is how can we protect ourselves no matter where it's coming from, whether it's a remote attack or local. You can still secure your Wi-Fi, and there are still things you can do to protect yourself. And sometimes that's monitoring. So how do we make sure that we're monitoring our networks to make sure that there isn't that malicious activity, setting stronger passwords or stronger authentication. And when you're a target, you have to take other actions. And so organizations that are more likely to be targeted by a really sophisticated actor need to take increasingly complicated steps. And that's something that we want to give advice and guidance on to make sure that we're helping.
Do you think that the government in your center has a fulsome awareness of the true nature and level of the threat? Or is there work to do?
I think we always stay on top of this. It changes constantly. As we put out new information and take new defensive measures, the threat adapts. And it's one of those things where you can never get ahead, but you always want to stay up to date. And so we try to predict, we try to make things more secure, we try to work with industry to raise that bar for everybody. But the fact is this is going to be one of those tasks that just never ends. We need to continue to be vigilant and work and react to the threat.
Do you know in this case if Canadian authorities discovered this threat, discovered what had happened, or were told by outside authorities outside this country?
Well, we certainly worked with our allies as we saw things happening within Canada. This is part of a broader coordinated effort amongst our allies to share information to protect us all. So sometimes things happen here, sometimes things happen other places, but we want to make sure that we're sharing information effectively. And sometimes a small discovery in Canada can lead to a larger discovery somewhere else, or vice versa.
When we talk about keeping up with that threat, I remember when the government announced the creation of this center, one of the main concerns that Minister Goodale at the time acknowledged was a shortage of expertise. Where is the center on that right now? Well,
it continues to be a challenge. There are a significant number of, we're hitting our recruiting targets for the center, but Canada-wide, we're not. We need to grow more cybersecurity professionals. We need to get more women in STEM, into science, technology, engineering, and math fields. And we need to look outside of the traditional fields for cybersecurity experts. Not everybody needs to come with a computer science degree. They can come in with other expertise and other abilities that we can then train them towards the cybersecurity. We need to get creative.
Is that effort happening fast enough? I mean, can you quantify the deficiency at this point?
I've heard various numbers, 10,000 jobs open or more. Canadian, I might have heard 100,000, but it is something that's definitely growing, the gap. It's getting harder and harder to find, to grow people, and enrollment is down in the programs, which seems counterintuitive to me that these are well-paying, good jobs that are expected to last for a very long time into the future. So we have some work to do as a community to attract people into the fields and to make the field attractive to somebody who wants to join.
Are you concerned that you won't be as effective as you can be on your mandate without those jobs filled?
Well, the beauty of the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity being part of the communication security establishment, there's a bit of cachet coming from a foreign intelligence agency to do recruiting. Our slogan is, "Can you keep a secret?" And that seems to attract a lot of interest in coming to work at CSE. And the creation of the Cyber Centre and our outreach is bringing more people in. But my goal isn't to rob talent from Canada and from corporate Canada. It's to make sure that together we can build things. So we're looking at other ways that we can build some expertise. And like I said,
but are you worried if that gap doesn't get filled, that, you know what I mean, there's a bigger problem ahead, especially at the rate at which the threat is growing, as you've pointed out?
Absolutely. So we'll be looking to some things like machine learning, artificial intelligence to kind of fill some of the gaps. But you still need creative people and creative humans to do the work. And that's where we're also looking at how do we train people outside of the field, people who have expertise. So, you know, librarians are actually very good cyber analysts. Things like that. The sociologists bring a different skill set that computer science might not. So we have to be creative in this. There are lots of people who have the skills we need.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mr. Jones. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.